intellectual story to who has been here before us. And I'm not talking about the North. I will talk about the North. I'm talking about the African intellectual history. Our Tiam. How many people have heard of our Tiam? Okay. If you have not heard of her, and you have heard of Foucault, bang your head in shame and give 55, I don't know, mangoes to each other to apologize. Our Tiam wrote a Senegalese, although she lived some of her life in Paris, but mostly in Senegal. She wrote a book called La Parole aux Négresses, the speech of black women, in 1968. It was published in English in 1973. She wrote it before CODESRIA was born. What did she write about? She calls herself a radical African feminist. That was a word that was not in circulation in the North. Or not very much in circulation in the North. Depends what you call, depends what you weigh. I mean, it's like, I'm talking about the popularity of the word. What did she write about? It's an extraordinary book. It's a book full of passion and weird research methodology. She rushes about West Africa, interviewing men and women around the politics of the body. She interviews them around marriage systems. She interviews them around female genital cutting. She interviews them around the politics of sexual relationships between them. She does look at violence. Sometimes she talks about pleasure. And there's a fourth chapter, which is extremely important. She looks at the politics of skin lightening. She looks at 4 areas in which she feels that gender and sexuality within a handful of West African countries. And the way she does it, we would look at it now and say, ooh, not sure this counts as scientific research. But it's actually brilliant. It's brilliant in what it's laying the ground for as a piece of intellectual history. She says that the politics of skin lightening, in other words, the politics of the body that are connected with imperialism, colonialism, and bodily performance are as important to understanding sexuality and gender as the politics of marriage systems, polygamy. She's looking at polygamy. She is an intellectual ancestor. If you have never heard of her, that is not your fault. It is about, because we all come from different places, right? We all come from different educations. If we've all never heard of her, except for our, that tells us something about those education systems. It doesn't tell us about our individual relationship to knowledge. It tells us about the systematicities through which we've been offered access to an intellectual legacy. So we can say, as Salihu did yesterday, feminism comes from the North. There are very strong feminisms in the North. We need to look at them. We need to see how they have influenced discourses and where they have done so in ways that are dangerous, in ways that are colonialist, a new colonialism, and in ways that we need to challenge. But if you had told our Tiam that she was Northern, you would have been smacked very hard. Frantz Fanon. We have heard of Fanon, yes. We have. He writes writes a great deal about the politics of gender and sexuality. He writes about the internalization of desire that has been colonized and that produces a set of projections about black masculinity, white femininity, within the meaning of desire and within the meaning of a colonized African consciousness. When he says African, he's working, and he actually uses the word black rather than African. He's working in Algeria, and he's working in a very particular political context, in debates with Senghor, with Césaire, but he's absolutely convinced that the mind, and it's Steve Biko who picks up on Fanon's ideas of internalized racism, that pick up from Fanon, and Fanon is talking about sexuality. He's talking about desire as much as he is talking about political structures. This is part of our intellectual story. That's the 50s, Awatian late 60s, Fanon 50s, Nawal El-Saadawi. She wrote when she was very young. She's Egyptian. She's now quite elderly. I think she's nearly in her 80s. She wrote memoirs of a woman doctor in the late 40s, of her experiences of traveling down the Nile as a woman doctor in rural areas, and what she found in relation to women's bodies. So I could continue this story. There are many, many more names. What I want to tell you is that sitting in this room, we have ancestors. We may claim some, we might want to reject others. But that intellectual history is a relationship to theoretical strength that we have to claim over and over and over again. Because it is one that is what I would call disappeared within our education systems. You know the way in which the Chileans and the Argentinians use the verb to disappear as an active verb. Like people get disappeared by a political regime. These knowledges, they get disappeared by our education systems. We have to reclaim them, because otherwise we don't have an ancestry. We don't have theoretical roots. And, now you are going to be very sorry and sad. Where did these roots go? I will give you these slides so you don't have to write them down. This is just a taste. It's just off the top of my head. Literally. These are gigantic names in what I would call African feminism. That doesn't mean they agree. It doesn't mean that they all work on the same issues. But it means that we have ancestors. Aisha Imam in Nigeria, Fatou Sow, Senegal, Amina Mama, Marjorie Bellini, Atalia Morokome, Barame Awe, Guy Mohoni, yes, Isabel, Aminata Diao, Zembe Oketa Dese, Fatima Manirsi, Joyce Enderly, Fatima Sadiki, On She Goes, Mary Kolowole, Dorothy Lewis, Puna Paula, Rudo Kazanwa, Isabel Piri, Debra Casente, Joyce Quinsiga, Oyeronka Oyewumi, Teresa de Silva Cruz, Charlene Pereira, and Kolia Zuma. Is she ever going to stop? Okay, I'll stop. Because what I'm doing is suggesting to you that you never have to begin your work by assuming you are alone. We talked about the fact that to enter this space of theorizing gender and sexualities takes courage. It worries us in terms of our own stigmatization and our sense of anxiety about the meaning of the North. We need to return to that. But actually, there is a very rich, nearly 50-year-old intellectual conversation that is extremely powerful around the areas that we want to look at. And if this history is something that you're interested in, I recommend to you a chapter in a book published by CODESRIA in 1997. It's called Engendering Social Sciences. It's edited by Ishema, Amina Mama, and Fatou Sow. And Fatou Sow's essay in that book, which was actually written in 1994, and it took a few years to publish the book, is part of this intellectual history. When I talk about this with some of my students all over the place, I say to them, this is not an area, this area of sexuality and political theory in which you can work from your stomach. It is a very, very sensitive area, it is a difficult area, it takes courage. We cannot work from our stomachs alone because we will burn out. We will get tired. People will tell us we are silly, we are Western, why are you talking to sex workers, why are you it's like, it gets exhausting. You have to sometimes work from your head. You have to work from your head. You have to be able to argue. Your intellectual history gives you the arguments. It gives you the arguments. So, know them, celebrate them, work with them, develop your own conversations with them. You don't have to agree with them. I don't have time to go through the multiple ways in which you might agree and disagree. Maybe we can do that in some other spaces. But never for a moment think that there is no such thing as an African feminist. Because to think that is to commit a level of what I would call global racism that is quite extraordinary. If you wipe out all those people as being not African, what have you done to them? What have you done to them? We need to think about that. How can we imagine any kind of consensus among this very diverse group of people? Economists, historians, sociologists, literary critics, musicians, development activists, lawyers. You will have noticed that Sylvia Tamale's name was not on that list, but it didn't need to be on the list because there she is. How does this group of people give us a set of theoretical principles? They tend to be strongly interactive with regional and local activisms and very engaged with the divide between those. If I'd taken one country, for example, if I talked to you about Fatou Machege, who works at the University of Kenyatta. She's the director of research there and does research around sexuality education. So she's an academic. I would not have been able to talk about her work without talking to you about the work of other Kenyans and other people within that setting, who Karai Mulungi, Mutoni Wanyeki, Awino Okesh, Betty Mukasa, all, like names just flooding into my head, who are not working in the academic sphere. They are working in a range of research and NGO spaces, but they are also creating knowledges. And that connection is often very live. There's a strong prioritization of an intellectual agenda as fundamental to the possibility of change. This is thoroughly within the tradition of negritude, of black consciousness, the tradition of liberation consciousness. African feminism has always imagined the decolonization of the mind to be an essential platform for work. So not like service delivery or welfare engagement or let's give people a well or condoms. Yes, that development stuff, it is sometimes useful that we can talk about it, but it's always worked with the mind. And the politics of knowledge production as being at the heart of engagements. So just to summarize this bit that we might want to discuss later, it brings us to questions about the term feminisms. Who are our influences? I'm giving you legacies, right? But in this room, who are our influences? What do we make of the question of the colonization by the West, by the North? In Senegal, one can actually refer to the West and one will mean the United States. If you refer to the West in South Africa, you tend to hit Brazil, which isn't so useful, and we call it the North. But where is it? What do we... It is certainly the case that there are two very strong sets of northern influences of which we need to be very, very careful. Or I believe we can talk about it. The one is the gender and development discourse, which is very, very powerful and which imagines gender in an overly simplified way, and a way which positions women continually as victims, as homogenized, and men as undifferentiated in relationship to power or political space. And it's a very powerful discourse, and we need to interact with it with extreme skepticism. The other influence is the influence of what I would call scholarship which doesn't come from the international NGO or NGO sector, which isn't motivated by development politics, which is motivated by the need to characterize feminism as an overarching ideology, so that patriarchies are the same everywhere. There was a very strong cohort of middle class and mostly white feminists located in Australia, in Britain, and in the US in the 70s and 80s, who characterized patriarchy as a globally identifiable phenomenon, and often used southern contexts, Asian ones, African ones, as particularly egregious examples of patriarchal violence. These feminists were challenged in their own contexts. They were challenged in America by people who called themselves radical women of color, some extraordinary writers. Patricia Hill Collins was one of them. Audre Lorde, that Sylvia referred to yesterday, was another. But their influence remained strong. Why? They had access to publishing. They had very strong northern-based library systems, so that today, if you put into Google search feminism and, if you put in feminism and poverty, you'll generate so much development stuff it'll make your hair turn grey. But if you put in, say, feminism and sexuality, the first things that will come up will be northern. They will be northern. One or two of them may be useful, but the majority of them will be thinking about patriarchy in ways that do not consider the project of colonialism as fundamental to the ways in which gender has been constructed. So you may get one or two ideas from them, but you need to watch out. You certainly need to watch out. But the question of influence in a global age is also a political question. We do not want to re-ghettoize any relationship to our own study. We want to be at the forefront of global knowledge making. So who do we want our interlocutors to be? Perhaps Latin American, perhaps Indian, certainly continental. We need to know what South Africans are saying, what those in Morocco are saying, what those in Madagascar are saying. We need interlocutors. We need to have conversations. Who are our alliances? Do we know about resources that are available to us that proceed from this intellectual history? You may say, okay, I'll go onto the internet, I'll look at the feminist journal, Gender and Society. Well, it has an intellectual history that is its own. It does not take some of the basic principles we might care about on board. So are there modes of publication that do? Yes, there are. Pambazuka News, for example, is fantastic. It's fantastic. It absolutely assumes this intellectual history. There are lots of debates in it, but it assumes this intellectual history. Feminist Africa, free online. It's now into its 16th journal. We're about to publish our next journal on African cinema and women's sexuality in that. The African Regional Sexuality Resource Center in Lagos, it's now no longer as strong as it used to be, but it continues to have a resource center that is available electronically. So there are spaces that we all need to know about and share and contribute to. And we need to be very political about our own choices in the area. So when we say, what is feminism? What are the ideas? First, we need to know the intellectual history. Then we need to be able to state particular areas of agreement. Because I can tell you, Aisha Imam does not agree with Amina Mama. Oyerunke Oyewumi does not agree with Bibi Bakare Youssef. Sylvia Tamale, writing in law, does not have the same conversations as Marjorie Mbelini, writing in governance and economic policy, does. So, we would need more time. That is why you don't get out of the room until 2015. In case you ask me the differences. So much up. I'm nearest the door. So what are the things we can say there's some agreement about for the sake of this symposium? That the politics of sexuality and gender, there's a strong agreement. Nobody would disagree about this. They might disagree about how you research it, how important it is, but nobody will disagree. That it constitutes a major and complex zone of control. The politics of sexuality and gender constitute a major complex zone of control over access to space, resources, power, and personhood. That this area is marginalized. Yesterday, Sylvia